So moving on, we have someone special, someone who is probably one step ahead of us. Valerie had a good news last week. She welcomed her granddaughter. Yeah, oh, yeah, I know. And what got her wondering is this little child is going to step into not just survive through the 21st century, but also will be seeing the 22nd century. So Valerie is already thinking about that, right? So we're really glad and thrilled to have someone amongst us whose career spans across leadership in education, research, teaching, capacity building. She's someone who's worked with the education system in US, Europe, Africa, USA, and now we are welcoming her to India to have the dialogue with our education system as well. What's also interesting is that she's been an expert contributor to WISE, which is World Summit on Innovation in Education, and also an expert advisor in OECD. And recently, she's also co-founded something called the Innovation Unit, and she was just talking about that, where they are looking at creating or innovating for thriving societies. And I, personally, am very thrilled because I'm someone who's agitated about conforming to an idea of success that the world defines. So I'm personally thrilled to hear what Valerie is going to share her story and her idea of success and how to thrive in the new world. Valerie?
Hi. Thank you for that introduction. This is the first time I've ever delivered a keynote in my socks, so I'm feeling pretty good about that. And the first time I've been party to a kind of a warm-up session where I feel that there's so much energy in the room, my only way is down. And what I'm fearing here now is that I'm going to, suck the energy out of the room, and you're sitting there thinking, oh my God, death by PowerPoint. No, save me, save me. So save me from that fate. I hope very much not to do so, but rather to keep the energy levels up and to locate your aspirations and the energy that you feel and the passion you feel for your mission in the course of a kind of a broader context. Because what I want to persuade you of is, firstly, that what Dream a Dream is about, what the whole notion of bringing empathy, bringing life skills, bringing a different dimension into education, that is now a part of a very big global conversation. And I'm absolutely certain also that you can't fulfill your mission until the kind of mainstream of education, the great kind of edifice of education through assessment and curriculum and pedagogy changes too. But you are going to be a really critical part of that movement. And so what I'm going to try to do this morning is to locate your work within part of both a bigger movement and a global conversation. I've just come from literally Singapore and Lisbon. From here, I go to Dublin and then Lyon, where people are having these conversations and really meaning it now, not thinking, we can just carry on business as usual, because actually we really can't. And I guess what my work has been about over the last 2 or 3 years has been researching and thinking about literally how we change the script. So when Vishal and I met, it was like the coming together of two souls. And we talked about my coming to join you here, and it's been a couple of years to make it happen. I'm really, really glad that it has now. So I've got about 40 minutes to put before you kind of an argument that I'm trying to make globally with a whole range of educators. Then for you to kind of critique that argument, build it, maybe, see how it supports your work and how it could be made even better. So that's the agenda, and I hope that doesn't feel too much of a letdown from your great start this morning. And I think the whole business of changing the script has to start way, way back up the line. It has to start with the question, what is education for? What is the purpose of learning? And it sounds such a ridiculously obvious question. People say it's obvious, what it's for. You've got to learn stuff to get a job. And no, really, think about this. Now, what is education for? And what I realized, I suppose, about 2.5 years ago is I started to listen much more attentively to what politicians said about why they were prepared to invest in public education, was that actually the fundamental story, the master story, if you like, is an economistic one. Usually, it starts not with a narrative about education around fundamental purpose, but about issues of growth and jobs. So you listen, even someone as thoughtful as Barack Obama, I looked over all his speeches, and actually the way he justified his belief in the education system was growth, almost always described in terms of GDP, and out of that, of course, jobs. Because everybody knows, don't they, that getting a job is the route to dignity and a good life. And the trouble is that this narrative just doesn't fly anymore. It actually doesn't work. And increasingly, people are starting to realize that. The whole business about GDP and growth, for example, you don't have to be wacky anymore to really critique that as an underpinning source for a good education system. Since I started to research my book, there's been a whole plethora, slew of new books from what I call the new wave of economists, critiquing both the notion of extractive growth, and there's a great new book just published last month by a guy called David Pilling called The Growth Delusion, and pointing out, drawing together the work of many, many economists now who are saying, we cannot assume that we can just carry on growing economies through extraction of the Earth's resources in a planet which has limited resources. It just doesn't work. Please believe me, this is not an attack on prosperity. How would I dare to come to a society like India and say such a thing? But actually, we are, as a planet, hugely prosperous. And we'll get more so because of technology, without extracting more of the Earth's resources. It's a question of how those resources are distributed. So GDP is fundamentally flawed, as is the notion of extractive growth. It's flawed in itself, and it sure as hell is flawed as a basis for investing in education systems. And secondly, the issue of jobs for all. Well, I think, a little bit about the employment situation in India, but interestingly, across the global north, and particularly in the UK and North America, there appears to be better employment numbers. If you politicians grab hold of, we're doing well because unemployment is dropping. Actually, if you look at the nature of that employment, a huge amount of it is very poorly paid, many people holding a series of jobs just to make ends meet. They're, in other words, massaging what it means to have full employment. And full employment, as automation grows, and I'm going to talk about this at some length shortly, is not something we can, in the future, aspire to. We're going to have to think better and differently about how we grow societies that really work for people and give meaning and dignity and decent levels of quality of life. So, perhaps the explicit purpose should be, and here's my proposition, that learning to thrive in a transforming world should be our overall purpose for learning. Maybe, just for debate, let's look at what that might mean. And that's the kind of conversation I'm trying to stimulate in a whole range of contexts. And if you think there's something in that, then it divides into two parts. First of all, digging down into what it means to thrive. Your idea might be quite different to mine. Does your idea mean having, a Rolls Royce and a Jaguar and houses around the world? Or does your idea of thriving look rather different? And anyway, is it a transforming world? What's the shift? So what I've tried to do in my book, and what I'm going to do this morning, is to bring together two sets of evidence. One about the idea of thriving. What do we know about thriving? Because there's an evidence base. There's actually a research base around individuals thriving, societies thriving, and indeed our planet. Let's have a look at that. And then secondly, what is happening in a transforming world? Is it true to say it's transforming? People have said to me, Valerie, you're overstating this. There's always been change. Everyone comes up and said, oh, this time now, there's never been change like it. And actually, people have always said that. It's always been the case. And I don't think that's true. I think that right now, we are living at a point of shift and, as it were, pivot, which the world has never seen before. And maybe that's what you want to come back to me on when I've finished my bit. But let me put the evidence before you, and then you can determine it. So I've tried to draw this together in this short book. I think it's around somewhere if you want to grab hold of it. I'm not going to be going into my references today, but the evidence is all there, and so you can take me up on it. And so the first bit of evidence is this. what evidence do we have about the coming 30 years? Not a very long time frame, really, but obviously no one can completely predict the future. All kinds of wild cards can come in and change the trends, which look as though they are fixed. We're headed in this direction. You know, there could be an asteroid hit the Earth. There could be a massive epidemic which shifts things just as the Great Plague did back in the 15th century. All kinds of things might happen which throw us off course. That's naturally the case. But at the same time, because of massively improved computing power, we've got a real sense of the way some of the trends in our lives and in the world are moving. And that's what I want to try and summarize to begin with. If you want, I mean, by the way, this is a hugely exploding area of literature now. If you go into any bookshop, you'll find futurology and a huge number of books on the shelves looking at the future. One of the best I ever found, and it still is, even though he published it in 2013, was by Al Gore, called just that, The Future. And what Al Gore did, it's not all about the climate, by the way, although that is, of course, his passion. He assembled 6 research teams, and he looked at trends and shifts in our lives, in humanity's experience across all of them, and he's pulled them together. It's magisterial. It's a really fine book if you haven't seen it. And what he says is this: there is clear consensus that the future now emerging will be extremely different from anything we've ever seen in the past. It's a difference not of degree, but of kind. And it's that conclusion I've grown to share. A second book that's really taken off now is by Klaus Schwab. Schwab founded the World Economic Forum that meets in Davos every year, and he's given this title to the 4th Industrial Revolution. So the 4th, following those of the Industrial Revolution, steam, electronics, and so forth, is what we are living through now. And he explores its disruptive power and where he thinks it's going to take us in many, many aspects of our world. And here's his conclusion. The changes are so profound that from the perspective of human history, there has never been a time of greater promise or potential peril. And it's those two things, the opportunity offered by these changes, but also the level of peril in which we stand, which have seized my imagination. His concern, he says, is that the decision makers are too often caught in traditional, linear, non-disruptive thinking and too absorbed by immediate concerns, usually re-election, by the way, to think strategically about the forces of disruption and innovation shaping our future. And that's what I see in education. People are just carrying on doing what we've always done. Same forms of curricula, same forms of teaching, as though we can carry on in a linear fashion. And my argument is we cannot. So the evidence suggests to me that there are 3 kind of buckets, 3 major tipping points. I've called them pivots because I think we're at that sort of point of the fulcrum where things are about to shift, which will distinguish our century before my granddaughter, if she makes it, gets through to the 22nd. The first is around a pivot point for our planet. The second is around a pivot point for technology and where technology is headed. And the third is a pivot point around us as a species and our own evolution. We are not, plainly, at the end of evolution, assuming that we get through the planet's peril. So let me take you through those in turn. And I've tried to organize it in this way because I don't know about you, but I've been to many conferences where people are telling me about how the world is changing, and they just sort of blitz you with 100 different kind of trends and shifts. But I think organizing them in this way gives you a mental handle to get a grip on it, but you must judge. Let's first of all take the planet. And what I argue is that our planet is at a tipping point from 3 sources. Firstly, the 6th Great Extinction. Secondly, the Anthropocene age, which you may or may not have heard of. And finally, climate change. And so this term, which just has entered the scientific literature, points to a new phase in which we have seen extinctions of species in the past. 5 of them, naturalists say, and they've come about through natural causes. This 6th one is quite unusual, well, it's distinctive and unique because it's down to us. We, Homo sapiens, have caused it. We've done it through the systematic elimination of habitats, through the utilization of a whole range of pesticides. Many of our taken-for-granted activities, which suit us very well as a species, are systematically completely eliminating, it is estimated, in the next 2 decades, nearly 50% of other species. Now, the question for us is, does that matter? What sort of pivot point will that bring about for our planet? There will be, if it continues and is not arrested, a very direct response and effect upon our own health. But to be less anthropocentric for a moment, do we have the right, the moral right, to think that that is okay? What kind of world are we looking at where the level of biodiversity is decreased and diminished to such an extent? Personally, I think it's unacceptable. You must make your own choices. But that's one strand. Second strand is the entry into what's now called the Anthropocene. This term entered the Oxford English Dictionary around about 2014. And geologists have now all agreed, yes, we are in a new geological age. Again, one brought about by, guess who? Your old friend, Homo sapiens. Through our activity, through the use of plastics, the weight of plastics now within the ocean is greater than the weight of all the combined fish. Through boring holes into the earth for oil, 50 kilometers down, through the elimination of mountains for coal, we are leaving the human signature on a new strata of the earth. So, again, through human activity, we are changing the very nature of the planet itself. And there it is, in all its beauty, which, of course, is getting toasted and fried as the climate changes and the Earth's surface warms. And in 2015, many of us felt maybe we've got some hope because the Paris Accord was signed by so many countries across the United Nations, and all of them agreed that they would do everything in their power to create policies which limited the rising of the surface temperature of the Earth to 2 degrees. And you will all know that that is thought to be the temperature at which life as we know it, without the kind of catastrophic effect of the rising of the oceans, acidification of the oceans, some areas of the world becoming completely uninhabitable, goes beyond a point which we can affect. Well, that was 2015. By the way, none of the previous accords on the climate have ever been observed by all the nations of the world, and you know what's happened since 2015. So the prospects are not looking good for our planet and for its thriving. And let's be clear, without our Mother Earth, we're toast. Second pivot point is technology and what is happening. I've called it the apotheosis of technology. And here I discern 3 strands of activity. Firstly, job disruption by robotics. Secondly, the rise of artificial intelligence. The two are linked, of course. And thirdly, global connectivity. What some people have called the creation of a great single mind linking the Earth. And in a sense, that is the hope and the opportunity. The level of connectivity through supercomputers, through sensors, through the Internet of Things, which has never been seen on the planet, and which offers such incredible opportunity to our children and to theirs. Unheard of and unknown yet possibilities. But alongside that, we're witnessing the disruption to what we've known in our lifetimes as the way work pans out, completely unprecedented. This is a book by a bunch of guys who ought to know. They're from McKinsey's, they're McKinsey's partners. And remember that McKinsey's make their living by advising big corporates as to how they're going to survive and thrive. And they have been writing about this stuff in unambiguous terms. So I think they know what they're speaking of. And they say, this is no ordinary disruption. And they call it that because there's been this fight between economists. On the one hand, a bunch of economists saying, you know what? We are going to see job losses on the most extraordinary scale. From Oxford University's Martin School of Economics, through to Merrill Lynch, through to the Bank of America, through to the Bank of England, all of them have brought out reports noting that something like from 47% to 20% of existing jobs will be washed away and taken over by automation. Now, even if those projections are like 50% wrong, and it's unlikely they're that wrong, this is a big disruption. Seriously. We're seeing it happen in all kinds of workspaces already, from journalism to finance to transport. In transport, of course, the big one will be driverless cars. It's not just driverless cars. Already being constructed are crewless ocean-going transport ships, completely crewless. So all of these areas of disruption are huge, but on the other side, there's a bunch of economists who say, yeah, we're going to lose jobs, but new jobs are going to be created by the new economies. So what gets lost, will be replaced elsewhere. And it's an interesting debate. I'm not an economist, so I don't feel qualified to debate it with them. But these guys would say this is no ordinary disruption, because although there will be some replacement, nowhere like the scale of what we have seen. So what does that mean for how we conduct our lives? If those levels of employment are going to shift downwards, and the new kinds of work, which I'll come on to shortly, are in very different spaces, that is no ordinary disruption. There's been a slew of books, too, on the way in which robots will steal your jobs. And it doesn't matter, it really doesn't matter, which sector you're working in. This is a kind of cheery one by Federico Pistono, who says, they'll steal your jobs, but that's okay. You can read it to see whether you feel quite so cheery at the end. I didn't, but he has some reasons for cheerfulness. Just some examples. This now. Has anyone met a now about 3 feet high? This now works in, as you can perhaps tell from the picture, works in Mitsubishi Banks. And his job, her job, is to greet people as they come in. She speaks 19 languages. She has facial recognition software, so she can tell as you come towards me, whether are you in the stressed corner or the confidence corner. She's not looking so good. I'm going to have to cheer her up. She's really good now because she doesn't get grumpy, she doesn't get sick, she doesn't take sick leave, she doesn't want a pay rise. Hey, who wouldn't want a now, Now has now started to proliferate into all kinds of other spaces. This is South Australia, where South Australia are utilising nows in early learning classes, and the kids love them. They're really, really good at teaching them in numeracy particularly. Incredibly helpful. Again, they don't get grumpy, they're just such. Here's an interesting one. You can Google this and find out. Georgia Tech, who've got a whole range of computer science courses, give a huge amount of their support to students online through tutors. But a couple of years back, they did an experiment with 10 tutors, but one of them wasn't human, one was a bot. And they collected data from the students who phoned into these helpers to get help with problems that they couldn't solve or difficulties they were having with their course. And they got the students to rate their helpers on the quality of the help they got. What do you think they found? Yeah, they did. The bot, who was called Jill, came up the top. They had no idea she was a bot, but actually she was a better helper. Think about that. And what about special needs? This is Lika. Lika is a robot which has been produced to help kids on the spectrum with autism. And they absolutely love it. She plays games with them. She does a whole range of kind of activities. And kids with autism, for some reason or other, can relate in this way to, I think, an extraordinary extent. So Lika's going big. In the States now, quite often you'll go into an airport and try and get some food. Actually, I haven't seen these guys serving it, but you certainly can order food with your iPad and have it delivered automatically without any wait staff coming anywhere near you. So in service industries, big-time disruption through robotics. And of course, they don't need to look like that. This is Yang Yang, who I think is charming. She's a robot. I hope you can see that. She's a hotel receptionist. So she's got all the kinds of qualities of now, but is better looking. So you get my point. Disruption in jobs is with us. It's big. It's not science fiction, fantasy. It's real. So going to the other half, there are new industries of the future coming up, and jobs will be created in them. Would any of you like to speculate what Alec Ross, who was Hillary Clinton, may God bless her, Hillary Clinton's advisor on innovation, and he spent time going around 140 countries in the world looking at where are the industries of the future rising up? Where are these spaces where the new jobs will be created and which will take over? Guesses where they are? Interesting. Care. Interesting one. More? Big industries of the future? design. Interesting, you're going on the people front, care, and on the, yes, the soft skills, in a sense. Well-being. Entertaining. Can you hear? Right. Let's take that one. So here's his finding. And I think it is rather a blinkered finding, particularly given some of the things that you've just said. The industries of the future that he finds growing up are robotics, genomics, codification of new areas, for example, money, cybersecurity, and big data. I think you guys are right, actually. Those will be flourishing areas, but whether they will create significant new job opportunities is an interesting question. Quite possibly not. What do they all have in common? A need, as far as education is concerned, for STEM. That if you are seriously interested in getting work in the new industries, not to have a very thorough grounding in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and maths, is hugely excluding. What a lopsided education, particularly given how right you were about some of those important areas. I'm going to come back to that. Okay, you're with me so far? We've had 2 pivot points. One around the planet, one around the apotheosis of technology and where it's going. And here's my 3rd pivot point, us. What is happening to us? Because from the reading of the literature, it would appear that evolution is passing into the species' own hands. No longer a question, as Darwin would have us understand, of natural selection, but we ourselves starting to select for the qualities that we want. Or do we? So I think there are 3 strands to this. One is around genetic engineering, where through genetic editing and genetic selection, it is possible now to create humans with a different kind of genetic makeup. And indeed to start to explore the way in which inherited diseases, certain kinds of qualities, can be eliminated or enhanced through the prospect of genetic engineering. This is happening in small ways. It will unquestionably happen in our lifetime. The conversion of human bodies with artificial intelligence and human enhancement technologies. Just staying with that second one, the convergence of human bodies with artificial intelligence. I mean, how long will it be? Oh my God, you're kidding, 5 minutes? No, we started late. Oh, no, we started late. I better check with the group. Are we all right to carry on a bit longer? Because I feel done down here. All right, let's get this right. We were due to finish at 20 past. I was supposed to shut up at 20 past. If I shut up at half past, is that all right? All right, I will read time for questions, but I did start late. Otherwise, the argument goes to hell. I mean, you can't do it. I'm going to rush over this then, because I've got a big bit to come to. Conversion of human bodies with artificial intelligence. Just a question. Look, how long is it before your Apple Watch is an implant? No time at all. How long is it before Google Translate is an implant? Ask yourselves. And as for human enhancement technologies, I won't dwell on it, but I love this. This is the way every aspect of a human body now can be enhanced in a human. I mean, most of you are enhanced, I would guess. I'm enhanced. I've had laser surgery. Some of you will have had new knees. Maybe you've got a new kid. I don't know. But enhancement is moving ahead at an incredible rate. That's not the big one. The big one is really genetic engineering. But here's the point that I want to leave you with. We are re-engineering our own evolution as a species. Don't tell me that's happened before, because I know it hasn't. Right, so what my point is this. If that's the evidence about the next 30 years, okay, what is the thought about how thriving looks? And I'm suggesting to you that you can't just talk about a single idea of thriving. There are 4 ways of thriving, but they're completely interrelated through 4 levels. One is planetary and global thriving. One is societal thriving. One is interpersonal, person-to-person thriving, and then there is thriving you yourself, I, the individual human. And the person who said psychology, no doubt, was thinking there that that whole business of how we thrive as lone individuals is very critical. What's their order of importance? Impossible to say, because they're utterly interrelated. You can't have one without the other. But I'm going to take them bit by bit and just say to you now, we've got an evidence base. This is not entirely values or ideology about what counts as thriving in these contexts. Actually, we know a bit. So to take the first one, I'm going to suggest to you that actually, if we want to thrive globally, there are 3 learning goals for our learning systems, for our education systems that flow. They need to be at the heart of education and not at the periphery, which is why I'm so interested in what you guys are doing, because right now, what you're doing is at the periphery, and it has to come to the center. And here, as far as planetary and global thriving is concerned, here are three kind of goals. 1, learning to live sustainably. 2, learning to protect the Earth's ecosystem of other species, the entirety of the ecosystem. And thirdly, acquiring global competence. Acquiring global competence. Learning to thrive as set out by those goals is kind of there in education systems around the world, but almost like an afterthought. And my contention is it has to be brought to the center.
Oh, sorry, what do you mean by global competence?
Coming to it, if she lets me. I'll stay with it for a moment. Firstly, then, let's take your question, global competence. If you'd said that word 2 years ago in education context, most people said, what? Furrowed brow? No idea what you're talking about. Increasingly, though, the set of global competencies is becoming much more explicit, much more stranded, and is translating into curricula. So global competence means being able to coexist in the world in a variety of ways with people from other cultures, other continents, and other global perspectives. In a world of huge migratory shift, we've never seen the levels of migration across the world now. In terms of immigration, in terms of global peace, global competence is going to be a fundamental quality of an educated human if we are to survive. And I'm just delighted to say that the OECD, who in my book have been kind of the bad guys of education for so long because they've been championing standardized results on the PISA tests, as you all well know, have now put out there a test around global competency as saying it has to be a fundamental skill of young people. Hallelujah. So if we bring that to the center, acquiring global competence, respect for other cultures, respect for other languages, preferably learning one, understanding different value frames and being able to coexist with them, that's a form of thriving which we are just at the foothills of exploring. And I think the other two are self-explanatory. If we move to the next level, societal thriving, I'm suggesting that there are 2 learning goals now that we need to go for. And it's not GDP, and it's not full employment. I don't believe they fly anymore. Here are my 2 goals. If we are to thrive at a societal level, I suggest young people need to be able to navigate a disrupted and uncertain landscape of work. That might be through becoming much more entrepreneurial. It might be the capacity to change your skill set very fast, a whole range of things. But also, alongside it, and you might think this is an odd one to include, I think to thrive at the societal level, we need to reinvent a participative, authentic, and meaningful democracy in whichever culture you happen to exist. Now, you may say, now she's getting ideological. I'm not, actually, because here's the evidence base. This book, a really, really important book by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, has influenced so many that if you haven't had a look at it, take a look. It's called The Spirit Level. You know what the spirit level is? It shows you whether something is level. And what they did was to take a whole range of international examples, I forget how many countries they looked at, and they examined them with a whole range of indicators of well-being. I think they had about 14 indicators, and they ranged from like postnatal depression, postnatal mortality rates, infant mortality, going through the lifespan to levels of incarceration in prison, through mental health, through obesity. You can imagine indicators that anyone would take to be signs of a thriving society. Took these indicators, had a look at these economies around the world, and here's their finding. Thriving societies on those indicators are not to do with how wealthy the society are. They are not. They are to do with how well the society's wealth is distributed. The greater the level of inequity, the lower that society scored on the indicators of thriving and well-being, which is why the United States was right down there. A wealthy country, but if you look at any one of the indicators, mental health, levels of incarceration, no good. Whereas less wealthy countries, because they equitably distributed their resources, scored much more highly on those levels of thriving. So you see, it's not just ideological, there's an evidence base around thriving. So my question then becomes, okay, if you thrive better because you distribute your resources better, what is the best lever, what is the best mechanism we have found to create better distribution, more equitable distribution of prosperity? It's not perfect, but it's democracy. It's the best we've got. And my contention is that we have started, I'm going to go quicker now because I'm running out of time. By the way, that's my model for higher education. So that'll save me 5 minutes exposition. You know exactly what I'm saying. And that is the point that the professions themselves are getting impacted hugely by robotics. My daughter's a doctor, and she says to me, Mum, being a doctor is really about discerning patterns. You listen to what the patient says, you look, you're trying to make sense of these patterns of symptoms. What is better at discerning patterns than the human being? Computers do it in a fraction. Now, doctors won't be redundant, they will be doing different and interesting things. But you name me one profession, and do not think it is a safe space for employment in the future, because it will be disrupted. They can be unbundled, can professional skills. They really can. And this book by the Suskins, father and son team, who explored it, came to a conclusion which I think this group will find particularly interesting, that when you start to unbundle the professions and you start to look at, well, what is it that will make humans exceptional, if anything, they offer empathy. Which is why the group coming up here with new ideas about the future were right. It's not going to lie in the grey matter, because the computers beat us to hell on that. It's to do with a whole set of different other qualities, and other people would locate it in the area of creativity. So, by the way, notice, though, that many people would prefer interacting with machines. You know, there are certain things you don't want your tax lawyer or your surgeon to be particularly good at. You're not interested in their empathy. Anyway, passing on. So the democratic disappointment was the piece I wanted to stay with, because I think one of the fundamental goals, if we are to thrive as societies, is to enable young people to reinvent forms of democracy that can work. Because the truth is, democracy has disappointed people thus far. And we are at a very, very dangerous point, I think, where the fragility of our democracies is starting to become clear. People are disappointed in it and wonder whether it's worth the candle. If you look at, just Google some of the survey data on young people. Be interested to see what our colleagues here think. And across the world, when asked how many people think it's really important to live in a democratic society, the young people said, oh, not so much. And how many people would be prepared to fight for democracy? Nah, not so much. This is at a very, very dangerous point. And it's understandable, because it's been disappointing. There's a really interesting new book by a woman called Srinad Poonam about India. It's been reviewed widely in the West. I don't know if you guys have seen it. But she takes sets of Indian young males in small-town India and looks at their dreams. And she contrasts, and by the way, it's young men that she looks at, no women at all. She looks at young men. And she contrasts the guys who think that their way forward is through their dreams of entrepreneurialism, and looks at some of them satisfying their dreams in that way. But, and here's the point about democracy, others, a much larger group, so disappointed with what their so-called democratic society has offered that they're retreating into a form of patriarchal nationalism, which is extremely dangerous for all of us and not just women. So a fascinating book, but which for me charts the form of democratic disappointment that we are witnessing. Therefore, I say, if we want flourishing societies, if we want greater equity, the route to it, it seems to me, is democracy, but young people have to reinvent it. And that's why, not as a little afterthought in civics or as an afterthought in social studies, but centrally, as part of their experience, they need to be learning how to reinvent democracy. And not for the future, but for their lives today, as they are in their institutions of school, which often are much more like penitentiaries than they are democratic institutions. So, moving quickly on, in my last 3 minutes. 2 other levels of thriving, right, I've got left. The first is interpersonal. of a particular interest to this group. And I say that there are two learning goals that ought to be associated with thriving interpersonally. One is to create loving and respectful relationships in these diverse and technologized societies. Do we give young people the opportunities to learn how to do that? Because it's a learning business. It's not luck. It's not just what happens in your family. It's a learning quest. And we can create learning experiences which help them create those kinds of relationships. And secondly, to engage with and learn from other generations. Why do I say that? Because that's why I stood with the centenarians. Our societies, I know India is the youngest in the world, but looking across the world, the population of centenarians is to grow. If that is to be anything like a dignified process for us as humanity, then we need to find new ways in which the old and the young can learn together and from each other. And that needs to be a central part of how we organize learning too. Just flipping back, this one is here because in terms of trying to create really loving and respectful relationships, many people would say that what we're witnessing coming to birth now is the Mowgli generation, not brought up by wild animals in the forest, but brought up by screens. And if you are brought up by a screen, if that's your closest companion, how do you develop empathy? How do you develop the kinds of relationships that we need? So I am hastening now to the final section, which just takes me here. Sorry to flip about. The intrapersonal, where I rest my case. None of those forms of thriving can work unless the individual can thrive herself. And what I want to argue with you is, and what I see systems around the world starting to take seriously now, it needs to be a fundamental and explicit and intentional learning goal. One, to create a secure sense of self in terms of young people's being. And secondly, a responsibility, learning how to take responsibility for your personal health and your fitness and your well-being. Knowing your body, learning your body. It's amazing. We don't come with like a manual. You know, it's took me 40 years to discover that I can't tolerate caffeine. What an idiot. It was making me ill the entire time. We have to learn our own body and whatever oddities your body happens to have. And in schools, kids ought to have the opportunities to learn their body, what makes it well, the benefits of the kinds of exercise that suit them and not suit the school. That should be a human right, not something, again, which is put to the periphery. In an epidemic across the world of obesity, how can we think otherwise? But the mental one is the bit that gets me most of all, a secure sense of self, a sense that you know who you are, that you're comfortable with silence with yourself, that you have a sense of personal purpose and meaning, whatever that might be. And don't say that that's irrelevant for schools, because schools need to find the spaces and the techniques and the ways, I think, that young people can do it. There's a whole plethora. One of them is actually being in nature again. This book explores the whole issue of what's now called nature deficit disorder. Kids who are kept, like penitentiaries, in built environments where they hardly see the light of day. Or if they do, it's half an hour on a playground, for God's sake. And I'm not talking about a week's camping trip. I'm talking about actually being in nature and understanding that you are part of nature. And I'll come to a couple of examples in a minute. But the question is this. Do you want kids who are mindful of stuff, or do you want them to be mindful? I know which I want, which I aspire to, which has taken me 60-odd years to get a grip on. And I know what I want for my granddaughter. And there's two journeys involved in that, obviously. But it seems to me, and I'm observing, partly as a result of these kinds of conversations, that when purpose is reset, schools can be reinvented. It might not sound like it, but I think we need schools. I'm not a de-schooler. I think we need to reinvent them and that we need them. And Pathfinders across the world, Pathfinders like Dream a Dream, which I talk about in my book, are showing the way. So this is the Kahuni campus of St Cuthbert's School in New Zealand, very, very high-achieving school. But they've got a campus where kids spend 30 days out in the wilderness, finding not the wilderness, but themselves, actually. And it's part of every kid's experience. It's part of what they do. This is a school in British Columbia, the Ellen Madsen Primary School, where they take intergenerational learning absolutely seriously. And the kids learn with, read with, hear stories from, tell stories to elders who are living in a care home. I hope when my old age comes, I might do something like that, because that strikes me as something worth doing. And the kids, what do you think? They love it. They absolutely love it. This comes back to the STEM piece. This is MC Squared School in Ohio, where in Cleveland, Ohio, they will not accept that the STEM subjects are just for the high flyers. And this is what you find, oh, they're hard, you know. We need to stream, and it's only a few who can get on to study STEM. And they won't have it. What they've said is that everybody can study STEM. They do it through project-based learning. They do not select their kids. Majority are black from very disadvantaged backgrounds. But they give them the kinds of experiences, partly through project-based learning and partly through citing their learning in places like the Great Lakes Science Center. They spend 2 and 3 weeks, firstly in the Science Center, and then working within General Electric, which has a center there. So they're in meaningful, relevant companies and organizations which give them powerfully motivating experiences. And everybody can learn STEM. And I tell you this, if you don't, you're going to be socially excluded in the future. Another Pathfinder here in India, Riverside School, where I think it's a sister organization, Design for Change, doing very similar work to Dream a Dream, where they put the notion of learning, social responsibility, and empathy at the heart of what they're doing. And finally, another one from New Zealand. This is the Te Kura School in, near Auckland, run by an amazing educator, one called Ariha Sterling. And she says, we in the Maori nation, we lost many of these fundamental purposes, and they are reasserting them with great confidence and doing fantastic work, not least around this sense of their young people, as the Maori nation always have, understanding that they are part of and not completely separate from nation. Aria says, we are the river, we are not alongside the river. So this is them proudly wearing their Maori dress, but don't think they're some kind of primitive back to the future stuff. Their work is powered through great technology, working from the cloud, as well as being within the nature that they love. So my point in giving you these Pathfinders, it's not like, ooh, wouldn't it be nice, you know, if only. It is happening across the world. You are part of that. But all I want to say finally is, the part of it that's critical for me is bringing these activities and these goals right into the center of our focus and not thinking there's some kind of nice to have at the periphery. So you should be confident and you should be assertive in what you're doing because you are going with the grain. You are not fighting against it anymore. I'm done. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Yeah, can I say it doesn't need to be a question? It can just be an observation or a blurt or a feeling, but whatever.
Thank you so much for this really illuminating discussion. I really enjoyed it. I have 2 kids, 5 and 9, and the biggest dilemma in our life right now is which school, right? I mean, they've been going to a certain school, and every single person I meet, I ask the same question. And my problem right now is there are schools which focus a lot on STEM, where you are really looking, and then there are the nature schools and spiritual and all of that. I am not finding any schools where I think there can be a balance. You have shown us some examples, but all the 4 layers which you spoke about, I mean, how long do I have to wait? Oh, I even think that my kids have an opportunity because it's more unschooling which is happening and parent-led schools, which again, now it's shifting to an extreme where they don't get STEM. And we are seeing the jobs in the future are going to be that. So it's, I'm really confused.
Okay. Should we take a few and then come back? Yeah? Keep it going. Yeah.
So I think the structure that you put around it was very useful. Thank you. I'm new to the field, but my earliest observation was that the field has had enough silos which have excelled across domains. Like in various parts, there are philosophies, there are theories, some with data, which schools or organizations and institutions have been able to follow and create magical outcomes. But they refuse to grow, or others refuse to learn. Would love your thoughts on that.
Okay, fine, got it, thank you. Shall I take those two while others are pondering? Oh, no, go, yeah, go. I'm all right.
I guess the question
Like a
is,
throne.
so the symphony that you talk about, the levels, the layers within which change would need to happen. In a society that is trying to figure out, as you said, this conversation right now is at the periphery. How do we get it to the center? Is there one of the layers that would be at the driving seat of this change? Is there one thing we can push for? Or should we as a society, as a country, be working on all four, which seems right now really, really like a goal which is further out?
Okay, let's take those three and others may follow. Can I say I feel your pain as far as being, I am a parent, but mine are well advanced in years now themselves. And God, the challenge of what to do around this is really tough. And I know many parents groups who said the only way to do is withdraw from the system, create our own school. In Britain, where the policies are unspeakably appalling, and I hardly want to touch on them, there's this been tiny chink where free schools have been created, and I've been involved in the creation of a few free schools, which parents groups can be involved in, can get money from government to create something which they feel rather more proud of. So what to do is a tough one. I mean, I think honestly, if I were a parent of a young child now, my strategy would be something like, scour what's available. Well, all right, so first of all, is deschooling, is homeschooling an option? Yes, no. If yes, then with the grouping of parents and also with the use of creation of networks through the net, it's a much more viable option than ever it used to be. And also the channels for great knowledge are open, the way they used not to be, so it is a more viable possibility. If no, though, if you say, no, it's going to be schooling, then I think my strategy would be something like yours. Scan what's available, get in early, make connections with other groups of parents, and start the kinds of conversations which I'm seeing in many, many places now. I mean, outside we can talk about some of the ones I've had, where parents are starting to create groups with teachers to ask these kinds of questions. What's it for? Give me some reasons about what structures what you're doing and how we can start to shift that in the direction. Because teachers want to do a great job. They do. And quite often it's teachers who are saying, oh, the parents are resistant, the parents are so conservative. And I think forming a kind of community of practice almost between parents and teachers and starting the big conversations might be a way in. But you have to start early on because, like you say, your kids are in school for a limited amount of time. And how much damage are you prepared to see done, frankly? But I really do understand what you're saying. On the question of scale, thank you for that. I get the question very much, and I'm heartened. I've been a very depressed professional for many, many years. But at this stage, I'm feeling a bit more optimistic because I see signs from around the world, like I said, of this global conversation starting to play benefits. And something that Vishal is involved in, I'm sure he'll talk about, which is the OECD, of all places. Who knew that they could possibly make a positive contribution? I think they're starting to. They've begun this project called Education 2030. And it's great that people like Vishal and other social partners are involved. It's big. A lot of countries are involved in it. And it's completely voluntary because countries have to pay to become involved. And what they're doing is saying, what's 2030 going to be like? And guess what? They find a bunch of the stuff I've just been talking about. Well, if that's the case, how can we create an education service fit for that? What does that look like? What are the competencies needed? And the work is, I think, really, really good. And what we're doing now is taking that project into the countries in a number of areas of the world, saying, if that's what's needed, what are the curricular changes that are required? What are the pedagogical changes that are required? And where are there schools in your jurisdiction who are doing it? And that's where they come into their own. Because if they won't have everything. They'll have slivers here and slivers there, but they're modeling how the thing can be brought together. So my hope is that through those kinds of external push-pull mechanisms and the great examples, then the great examples can find opportunities to scale, because they will come into their own. People will want them to show how to take it forward. And the final point, remind me what the final point was. It was on 4. Okay. Honestly, I know it sounds absurdly hard, but I can't disentangle them. It's no good if we're all fundamentally mindful beings who have respect and empathy with others if our planet is toasting beneath us. We have to become activists and involved in that. We have to understand the direct consequences of our actions there. And equally, if our society is becoming dysfunctional and ugly through some of the forces that we've talked about, how can we thrive personally? I cannot disentangle them, I cannot. And I think we must keep them integrated and show how they play with each other. You will grow a stronger sense of self if you understand the reverence we must have for nature. I mean, you know, for me, it's entirely integrated, so I don't think we can disaggregate. That would be my response.
Thank you. So we'll take 2 more questions.
If there are 2 more, okay, there are.
Hi. Mine's more comment than sort of an observation. I'm a huge sort of believer in the future and futurist, so I subscribe to everything you've said. I also think that the one thing that perhaps countries like ours actually have a strange sort of sense of advantage over more advanced parts of the world is the fact that our education system today, at least in a large part of the non-urban areas, is currently so fragmented. I think there is an opportunity there, especially in the world that you're talking about. The skill sets that you're talking about are skill sets that are not as difficult to get for somebody who can't afford education in the conventional sense. The conventional sense of education is trying to make you an engineer or a doctor in India's current setup, which I don't think are the jobs that the future holds for most people. And therefore, the opportunity that I see in the Indian landscape is if you can bring these skill sets, which I think when you talked about empathy, you talked about creativity, you talked about, these are not things that need a lot of money. They need the right sort of help in being able to give them. And because we're so disorganized in the way our education is structured, if we can go there and organize it in a particular way, I actually think, at least in a country like India, we can actually leapfrog the sort of poverty question to a large extent and get people to the same opportunities in the future just by if we intervene at the right time. So I just think that perhaps our problem can be fixed in a strange way with less effort than some other parts of the world.
I'm going to come back to that. Yes, please.
Hi, Valerie. So my question is more around, so there are a certain sort of skills maybe you've identified as sort of what thriving means. How much of these do we believe that children of today can build for themselves, right? How much of them need to be interventions per se, right? And they're very specific, whether it's you're talking about democracy, living sustainably, intergenerational learning, they're very, I mean, I find them honestly far too prescriptive, saying that these are the 5 things you need to do. Could one maybe abstract it out a little and saying, okay, these are the sort of things that we broadly need to do, maybe by the child, and you know, by the time the child is say 10 or so, and then we largely depend on the child to figure it out for themselves, to sort of equip themselves to sort of deal with this changing world, right? I mean, how does that sit with your sort of gentle thinking?
Okay, I'll go backwards, start with you, and then if I can finish, I'm sure we need to finish with your observation. Thank you for it. I find your argument very odd. I find it strange. Why would we leave kids to find it for themselves? What is education for? You know, come back to my early question. Surely it's society's responsibility to try to determine what are the qualities, the competencies, the skills, and the knowledge base that young people need, and I'm suggesting, in order to thrive. Not to succeed in the old terms, because as I've tried to demonstrate, I think that's a busted flush. And if that's right, why would we leave them to manage it on their own? I mean, the skills and the outcomes that I've talked about here are things which require learning. They will require access to a structured knowledge base, and that requires people to help them navigate their way through it. It requires access to the right kinds of experiences, which teachers can, if they're well placed, choreograph and curate in ways that kids working on their own never can. So I find it very strange to imagine that school would just sort of carry on doing what? Filling them with maths and science and the academic subjects, and somehow the kids are left to find out the rest themselves. It seems to me that we need to reverse that and that they will acquire with gusto, with enthusiasm and speed, the grounding in those so-called academic subjects when they are applied to circumstances that they clearly see that they need in order to lead thriving lives. So what I'm trying to do is mold those together. If you think it's too prescriptive, that imagines that the current education system isn't prescriptive. Of course it is. It's got a whole set of learning goals already set out in curricula and examinations, which for many kids are utterly irrelevant. Well, they're ones based at least on an explicit intention, which we can debate. And actually, I didn't show my final slide, which I now will, so thank you for the prompt, which is the future is not fixed, but some trends are clear, aren't they? We can impact upon it by setting a clear purpose for education. We can be part of shaping our future rather than just responding to it. And we may not agree what it means to thrive. Okay, I'm probably wrong in about, I don't know, 20% of what I say, maybe 50% of what I say. But at least can we debate it? At least can we be saying to each other, what do we want our education systems to achieve? And if it's not thriving in these kinds of ways, then what is it? What's the alternative? So that's my response. To your observation, I think it's really, really interesting. And I'm far too ignorant of the Indian context to comment intelligently, but my observations thus far lead me to agree with you. And some of the research leads me to agree with you as well, because if you've read the Brookings Institution report, which I know Vishal knows very well, called Why Wait 100 Years? It suggests that if education systems in the global south and in low-income countries seek to ape and recreate the systems of the well-developed countries, no, I don't hate that term, high-income countries, there will be a wait for 100 years, even to get to the kind of standards that there are now in those countries. Why wait 100 years? And Brookings, and I agree with them, think that leapfrogging, that is to say, not going at the same pace and on the same path, absolutely is possible by an asset-based approach, which is not a deficit approach, which is saying, where are our strengths? What can we build upon in our particular context, with our particular cultural, historical perspective that draws upon the strengths of our nation and not somebody else's model? That's a really tough ask, and we might think about together what leapfrogging might look like. A lot of people are working on that now. People in Nairobi and various centers around low-income countries are saying, no, we're not about trying to create what Finland have got or what South Korea have got. We need something which fits us. And we have a huge number of strengths that we can build on in order to do that. But again, it needs to be in a direction of travel. Towards what? For what purpose? And my suggestion is get clear about the ultimate objective. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks.